Live. We are recording, and hello, everyone. In fact, we
Recording stopped.
Live on TikTok for the first time this time too. So we have TikTokers joining us here, who we don't see. So welcome back. Yeah.
Daniel, it says the recording stopped.
Yeah, that's okay. We're streaming it a different way. That's fine. So welcome back, everyone, for the fourth session of what we're calling the story of us, the ongoing story of the Jewish people. Just as a reminder of what it is that we're doing, because it's suddenly become almost political, what we're doing, which is so interesting. But we are going back to the very earliest people who would have imagined themselves as us, right? Which is to say, we're not going back to the first Jews as Abraham and Sarah, but we're going back and asking ourselves, who were the first people who told themselves stories about Abraham and Sarah, who told themselves stories of the Exodus from Egypt? Who were the first people to recognizably tell themselves a story that feels like the one that we tell ourselves? Make sense? Yeah? We're on the same page? I know that's sort of what we've been going over every time, but still, I think it's good to set the pace. So we have talked about the first folks who thought of themselves as Jews living in what we now call the West Bank, the mountains of the West Bank, who told themselves the Abraham and Sarah stories. We talked about, the Exodus from Egypt stories and the Moses stories living in the West Bank. We talked about them as settled folks, people living in settled agricultural communities with land ownership, with cities or small cities and central towns, and a middle class that was tiny but began to develop, as contrasted with those folks living in the south of Israel, also at the same time, also around 1250 BCE or so. And these folks living in the south of Israel, of course, had a different main god rather than El Elyon, the god of high places that those in the north with their Moses stories did. The folks in the south instead had the god of Yud He Vav He. Had the God of that we've come to call Jehovah, Yahweh, however we pronounce it, or don't pronounce it, as Jewish tradition generally asks of us. And they told the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. So we've looked through time to the year 1000 BCE as a southern king came to power, an occupying colonial southern king, and captured the north and occupied it. This, of course, being King David, who later myths talk about being the unifier of Israel, and we're going to talk about that mythology today, but who at the time was certainly an occupier. And in fact, we read the story of David and Bathsheba as a northern polemic against the southern occupier king, King David. So then last week, we looked at the idea of story and how they are always retold in the image of the storyteller, that in every moment we are always retelling it in our own image, whether we're telling stories about our grandparents, whether we are talking Midrash, or whether we are talking the biblical narratives. So in fact, we looked at 3 chapters that are the same story told by different writers. We looked at the so-called sister wife tales, and we contrasted the sort of pretty clearly earliest version that we find in Genesis 12 with the much more edited, much more refined, much more cleaned up versions of Genesis 20 and 26. Okay, I think that's everything that we've done. So thoughts, questions, comments, where are people's heads at? Any questions or thoughts around this? Nothing?
Well, I must say that I thought most of the week about David and Bathsheba and Uriah.
Yes. Yeah, it sticks with you. Just a note for people who are joining the stream, all we've done so far is review. I just had to stop the stream and start it again, so this will be new for folks, and we'll jump into new content in just a moment. Okay, any other thoughts, any other lingering questions, whether on the idea writ large that we've covered or any of the specifics? If not, we're going to jump into new content. Okay, here we go. So, I want us to pause for a moment and try to undo all of the layers that we read the biblical narrative with. And one of the earliest layers that we read the biblical narrative with that we don't even realize is there is that we read it like it is one complete story. We read it like has a beginning, a middle, and an end, even if we're just talking about the 5 books of Moses, like Genesis and then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And what I want to suggest is that this itself is the work of an editorial process and generations of editors who are putting it together in a way for us to read it as one unit. However, when we really dig in, when we really look at it, I think what we will notice about the biblical narratives is that there are 2 different sets of stories, and we've talked about this, right, in the North and the South, that exist within our Torah. Just the 5 books we're talking right now, right? We have the stories of the Matriarchs and the Patriarchs. And if we think about the setup of the Matriarchs and Patriarchs, the so-called Abrahamic covenant, it's actually kind of startling because there is nothing that is asked of Abraham, and the contract is entirely about God's obligations. We talked about this a little last week, but right, that there will be land, progeny, and wealth, that Abraham will be brought to a land which God will show him, that he will have children as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the beach, and that he will be wealthy, a land flowing with milk and honey. By the way, just a little side note about that. The milk and honey is goat's milk and date honey. So you will see, if you know to look for it now, you'll see in Jewish art pictures of a goat with its paws up on a palm tree and dates usually dripping into the mouth of the goat. This is an image of the land of milk and honey, and we totally just don't have a cultural frame to understand that. So now that you know it, you'll see it in places. I feel like my grandmother had one that she had, I forgot what you call it, right? We have a western wall that she needle pointed or whatever it is, and we have a land of milk and honey. So these are the promises to Abraham, but Abraham doesn't have to do anything in response other than go on this journey. But by the time we get these promises, Abraham's already gone on that journey, which is to say that the obligations of Abraham and his family have already been met, and it's only God's promises that are a part of the Abrahamic covenant, including, by the way, circumcision. Circumcision is not, in fact, a required part of the Abrahamic covenant in order for God to keep the covenant. Instead, it is a symbol, a sign of the covenant on the flesh of his tribe of people who have penises. That is the idea, but it is a sign of the covenant. It is not a requirement of the covenant, which is just a little interesting here, right? So that's the Abrahamic covenant when we look at it. And so we expect the stories of Abraham and his family to end how? To end happily ever after with Abraham and his family in the land of Israel. Now, of course, that is not how the story of Abraham and his family ends. But pause for a second and appreciate that that's what we expect. And it's what we should be led to believe is coming if we hadn't ever read this text before. Now, totally separately, we have these Moses stories. We have the stories of a slave rebellion, of a mixed multitude, a mixed ethnic multitude of people living under Egyptian enslavement who come and end up in the north of what we would now call Israel and the West Bank. These stories exist in an entirely separate world. If you don't know anything about them and we just were to hand them to you, you would not imagine anything about Abraham and Sarah and their families and their kids. Okay. The comparison I sometimes make here is, any other Star Trek fans here? I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I am not a Star Wars fan, and don't get them confused, because Star Wars and Star Trek are different bodies of mythology. They don't exist, right? The Death Star doesn't exist in the same universe as the USS Enterprise. They just, right? Or the NCC, right? They don't exist in the same universe. So if you know comics, I am not a comics person usually, but if you know these sorts of worlds, you will know that there's almost certainly a comic book series about the time that Captain Kirk gets accidentally beamed over into Star Wars land, right? The crossover comic book between these totally disparate bodies of mythology. I promise we're going somewhere related to the Torah in a moment. This is what's going on inside the Torah itself. We have two totally different bodies of mythology, as different as Star Wars is from Star Trek, in the Exodus stories on the one hand, and on the Genesis Patriarch, Matriarch stories on the other hand. So today we're going to talk about how those two bodies of mythology came to be one, and to think about the bridges that were built in order to make that happen. Make sense? Any thoughts? Any questions? Any? No? No, we're working? Hello, TikTok Live people. By the way, I'm going to check your comments every once in a while, but we're also on a Zoom here. Okay, so let's start talking about this historical process. So the last time we checked in, David, this occupying southern empire builder king of the south, had destroyed the northern resistance. He had captured and sacked Jerusalem, and he was quite unpopular in the north. This ends up lasting for, just a few generations. Even the biblical telling of it describes that it's David's son, Solomon, who takes over, and then after Solomon, it basically falls apart once again into two different kingdoms, which makes sense because we spent the whole first few weeks of this series talking about how the people who are living in the north are living in agrarian settled areas, and the people in the south are nomads. And these are very different cultures that aren't going to sit well with each other in the same way that ranchers and farmers still do not get along almost anywhere in the world. And so what ends up happening is this empire falls apart. Mini empire, right? And turns into two different kingdoms. Now, when we back away from all of this to the geopolitics, we need to understand that both of these states, the north Israel, the south Judea, are what we call vassal states of the Assyrian Empire. This is the great northern empire. At various times, it's called the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. Who's in charge changes, and the slight geographic boundaries change. But this is a northern empire that stretches at various moments from Turkey all the way through to Iran, with all of the spaces in between as well. So the Assyrian Empire, both of these nations, Israel in the north, Judea in the south, are vassal states.
Question?
Yeah.
I have a real quick question. So you said it's from Iran and Turkey. What is the far western end of it? Is it the...
Turkey tends to be about the far western reach of these areas, generally.
Okay,
but you can find Google maps of Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and you will see various things at various times.
Sorry, I think the audio is not working on Facebook because Dan Elfenbein wrote that he couldn't hear, and I also couldn't hear.
It's not working on the Facebook stream. I'll upload it later.
Okay,
So,
I'll tell him.
Yep.
Sorry.
Sorry, everyone. Okay. So, look up the maps of the Assyrian Empire, and you'll see the various moments and the various times at what it looked like. But both of these states, the north and the south, Israel and Judea, are vassal states, meaning they have to pay their taxes to the Assyrian Empire, and in exchange, the Assyrian Empire basically provides protection from Egypt, which is to say that they provide protection from themselves as well, because this is a mob racket that we are talking about. You don't pay off the Assyrians, something might happen to the front window of your store that you got there that looks so nice. That's kind of the idea. Now, the Assyrian Empire is in collapse. Now we're in let's call it the 750s BCE or so, the 8th century BCE. And the Assyrian Empire is in collapse. It is going to turn into the Babylonian Empire sometime soon, but it is not there yet. And so the north, Israel, decides that they're done paying their taxes to the Assyrians. And this is an empire in decline, and there is nothing quite as dangerous, I think, as an empire in decline. So the Assyrians go and they destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. They, in fact, engage in what actually politically makes a lot of sense for them in this process of cutting off the cultural head of the peoples that they conquer. They take all of the priests and the scribes and the nobility and all the educated class, the storytellers, the culture makers, the leaders, and they cart them off to their capital city, which provides both a brain drain for them, right? They get all the best and brightest from everywhere to their capital. And what it means is within a few generations, the people who live there no longer have the old story of themselves. All of a sudden, the great-grandchildren of the folks of the northern 10 tribes instead have a story they tell themselves about being Assyrians rather than about being Israelites. Does that make sense? You might compare it, don't push on this analogy very much because I don't mean it in any of the moral ways, I just mean it in the identity ways, that you'll find someone who, their grandparents were Jewish, but they didn't, or their great-grandparents were Jewish, right? But they weren't raised as Jews and their parents weren't raised as Jews. And so all of a sudden, is this person meaningfully Jewish? No. And it doesn't really matter whether their mother's 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 mother was Jewish, because the real question is the story that they tell themselves about who they are Jewish? And if the answer is no, then they have become something else. Which is to say that if you want to go looking for the descendants of the lost tribes, don't go into Africa and India and Jamaica. Look around at Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan and Egypt, and these are the literal descendants of the lost tribes. They've just told themselves a very different story of who they are for now 2,700 years. Right? That's when we're talking about, is 2,800 years ago. Okay, so there's, by the way, your mythology of the lost tribes of Israel right there. But as this process of war, as this war of the Assyrians against Israel is going on, it lasts for decades, basically. It's a slow process. There's a number of the most well-connected folks living in the north in Israel who flee south. They flee south to Judea, away from Israel, and in particular, they congregate into the urban area of the south, Jerusalem. And more these refugees from the north are taken into Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, they are welcomed with the same open arms that humans have historically welcomed mass amounts of refugees at every time and at every place. Which is to say, of course, that they weren't welcomed at all. That they were seen as this outside invading horde at some level, right? Who are coming to Jerusalem, they're coming to take our jobs, and they begin to live there. Now, as they begin to get settled, as they come, what happens is that over the next few generations, slowly, these folks marry into other Jerusalemite families. So slowly, over the better part of 100 years, what ends up happening is that more and more people come from two different stories. And these stories don't even compete with each other. They're just two different stories. You have generations in Jerusalem who grow up coming from the mountain people of the West Bank who were the descendants of enslaved Egyptians, and also from the south who have these stories of having come from Abraham and Sarah and this northern community that came and settled into Jerusalem. And so we see the merging of these two bodies of mythology literally in the personhood of the individuals primarily living in Jerusalem. Make sense? Okay, so now you've got all of these northerners coming south who are trying to convince the southerners, please, take us in. And the southerners clearly pushing back in the same way that people push back against large amounts of refugees everywhere, unfortunately. And so this is where, once again, how we retell our story matters more than the history. This has been one of our themes, right? Memory over history. Memory meaning what we do with the story rather than history, which is what happened. So you may remember in the year 1000, David was the evil occupier of the north. But 250 years later, when northerners are fleeing south, begging to be taken in as refugees from the Assyrian invasion, all of a sudden, David as a foreign occupier is not a compelling, meaningful set of stories, but David, the former unifier of our people, is. And so you have these northerners who all of a sudden are fleeing south and claiming David as their ancestor, whereas decrying and pushing back against David was the political identity of northerners just 200 years before that. But it serves a different need now. So one of the questions we asked when we were looking at the story of David and Bathsheba, this clear polemic against David, a clear northern polemic against the southern occupying king, was why does this end up in the Bible, right? Why is it in the Hebrew Bible at all? Why does an editor leave it in there? And I think this is our answer that we are seeing right here. And that is that editors, by the time they're making the decision of collecting all of the stories of David, the idea of there being tensions between the North and the South are gone. That's not a part of their reality anymore. That's not their politics. And the idea of there being tensions between the North and the South when Assyria is destroying us all is so unimportant that the people making the editorial decisions about the stories of David, it's not just that they don't care about those politics. It's that they don't even know about those politics. They don't exist in their world. All of a sudden, David and Bathsheba, for the editors collecting these stories, isn't the story of an occupying southern king. It's just one of the many stories of King David that we have. Does that make sense? Susan, you're giving a quizzical look. You're right in my middle, so I see you right here.
I'm not sure it makes sense that they wouldn't just jettison that story. I mean, yes, it was part of the northern mythology, but why keep it? It doesn't seem to serve a purpose once it's not a function of the animosity towards David.
So sometimes the answer, and really this is all conjecture here, right? We can't answer that question because we can't go back in time and speak to the actual people making these decisions. But sometimes what ends up happening, this is probably the same answer as the sister wife story and why it ends up being included, is that some of these stories gain such cultural prominence that everyone already knows them, and so its absence from a collection is itself a problem. And remember that these folks who are putting these stories together that we later come to call the Hebrew Bible are not collecting the Hebrew Bible. They're preserving anthologies of stories. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that process of preserving stories not next week, which is Thanksgiving, but the week after that when we talk about King Josiah, one of the most unknown Jewish leaders who's probably amongst the 10 most important Jews to ever live. So 2 weeks we're telling the story of King Josiah. Yeah?
So how does all of this fit with the view of divinely written Torah? I mean, I tend to believe what you're saying, but I can see where someone who thinks that the Torah was inspired and written by God, how they can integrate this perspective on how it all came together.
That's a great question. I'm going to answer it sort of obtusely here. I apologize. Which is to say that part of what we are going to do as we move forward in the story of us is look at the process of Jewish groups beginning to think of the Torah as being divinely revealed, because it's pretty clear that the stories themselves to the people that we are talking about back in 750, the stories were sacred stories of their ancestors, but the specific words have no connotation of having been written by God's self. That is a much later cultural addition, influenced first in probably the largest extent by Islam. Islam develops the notion of scripture as we know it today, really. You don't have scripture as we imagine it without Islam, which, so now we're talking 1,400 years later than we are right now in our story. And then even more so, this becomes another influence in Jewish communities of Christianity, and in particular Protestant Christianity, to the point where in Mizrahi and Sephardi communities, the Jews, particularly living in the Arab and then later Muslim world, have much less intensity around divine revelation than Jews in the Ashkenaz, who end up being influenced by the Protestant Reformation. And again, we'll get to that hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years from now in Jewish history. All of which is to say that it's a process of creating the idea of Scripture as well. Yeah, Sarah.
I was going to say that we already know there were people who wrote stuff that we read and take to heart. We actually know about it when you look later on, and a lot of the Gemara and a lot of the stuff that came out of the Babylonian exile, and because we know about that. We know that wasn't necessarily, God coming down and handing template.
So this ends up being a process that ends up happening. Exactly. And
so it's kind of hard to say, well, all of a sudden we were no longer given divine word. That doesn't happen. So we just accept that, somebody had to write it. Some human was involved in this. We're not going to fight about that,
So
it's humans reading it.
The other way I want to frame this is that in some core ways, what we are doing in this class we call the story of us is deeply anti-Orthodox. I don't mean anti-Orthodox as a movement, but the core part of Orthodoxy is actually deeply ahistorical. Orthodoxy imagines that the version of the world as they live it is a version of the way Jewish has always been. And the thing of it is that today's Orthodox actually are pretty radically different from the people who lived in the shtetl 200 years ago, even as today's Orthodox imagines that they are living like the people of the shtetl. And the people of the shtetl 200 years ago were actually living pretty differently than their ancestors 200 years before that, even though they imagined that they were living as the same way as their ancestors. And let's keep going backwards. The refugees from the north living in Jerusalem absolutely understand that they were being taken in by their cousins who used to be a part of the grand empire that David created, even as their great-great-grandparents would have said, oy vey, like, you're living with our occupiers. That all of those are true because always what we do as humans is we retell the myths of the past into our current moment for current meaning. Sometimes more explicitly, sometimes less explicitly. When we get to Midrash, it becomes explicit that that's what's happening. And what I'm hoping to peel back as we look at these stories that form the Torah and the Hebrew Bible is to see that all of those layers and all of those generations of ancient Jews are a part of creating the documents that come to be the Torah and the Hebrew Bible as well. Let me say that big idea in a different way. Oftentimes, I think we are told that Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible. We are the people of the Jewish religion. And what I want to suggest instead is that Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, and the Torah and the Hebrew Bible are themselves products of Jews and Jewish civilization. Right? The Bible is a product of Jewish civilization. Jews are not the product of the Bible, even as, of course, it becomes symbiotic and back and forth and so on forth, and you can't escape any of that, nor would we want to, because mythology is wonderful and human. Okay, did that make sense, what I just said? That's sort of a big idea, but I also think it's a core idea to what we are dealing with here. So any other thoughts, any ideas? Any comments? So,
Actually, I have one, David.
Please.
Daniel, I mean, and that is, that was then, but is that really true now? Because
hold on. So, is what really true now? Sorry.
that Jews are not the product of Torah and the Bible, because now it seems that that's what the emphasis is on.
Sure, it becomes symbiotic. Absolutely. But I would still say that Judaism is the product of Jews. So the other thing I would say, and this is so counterintuitive, is that actually this class is also kind of anti-rabbinic. One of the problems of our current moment and at various other historic Jewish moments, but certainly of our current moment, is that to be a rabbi is at some level to be a religious leader and some level to be a Jewish communal leader in the American context, right? But what's happening then is that the storytellers of Jewish identity within Jewish communities are disproportionately rabbis, which means the rabbinic and religious lens for Jewish identity is inappropriately and distortingly overemphasized. Right? Which is to say, if you went back in time, I don't know, 100 years, Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture, even as it was clearly in relationship to Judaism and Jewish language, in the same way that Leonard Cohen is in relationship, would not have centered the faith in Judaism in the same way that contemporary Jewish identity does. So it's clearly symbiotic, it's back and forth, it's feeding each other, it's right, and in particular, as we get to the Babylonian exile in 3 or 4 weeks, we will see the ways in which we remake ourselves into the people who tell ourselves the biblical narrative. But even there, that's what I would say, is we are the people who tell ourselves this story of who we are, rather than being the mythological creatures of the Bible. We might be getting too meta here for the moment, I'm not sure. Okay, any other thoughts there before we keep going? Okay, so now let's think about the bridge between these two bodies of mythology. So we've talked about a little bit J, E, P, and D, right? These theories of how the Bible was written, what we call documentary hypothesis writ large. But to back away from that, we've presented it as really these two big sets of stories: the Genesis narrative, Matriarch, Patriarch narratives, and the Exodus narratives, the Egypt and leaving Egypt and receiving the Torah narratives. So when you think about them as not being destined to meet, and if you go back to our idea of the comic book series of Star Trek and Star Wars combining, what is that equivalent in the Torah? It's the story of Joseph. So if you think about Joseph for a moment, Joseph is actually the longest unbroken piece of literature in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. It is a discrete story with beginning, middle, and end. It goes from chapter, I had this up and I accidentally closed my window. When does Joseph start? Is it 39, 38, somewhere in there, 35? I think 35 through 50, if I'm remembering. It's something like that. It's a huge chunk of the book of Genesis. Abraham, with all of the various collections, all the different sister wife tells, and all the different, is like nothing. It's just a handful of chapters that we get. Joseph is basically as long as all of the matriarchs and all of the patriarchs combined that came before Joseph. So first, I just want us to see that, because again, we get so used to reading the Torah as one piece of literature that just goes in a flow, that we miss that this is a very different genre, and it's a very different piece of literature that we stumble into when we get into the Joseph stories. Does that make sense, that setup that I just, yeah? Any confusion on that? I want to make sure we're on that page. Okay, so what is the story of Joseph when you really look at it. It's the story of a whole bunch of brothers who don't get along, who in fact are constantly taking advantage of the ones that feel like they're the luckiest or the best. Or again, imagine for a moment that this is an allegory for each of the tribes, because it clearly is, right? Each of the brothers of Joseph are the names of the tribes. And think about a world where you are from a particular tribe that's now being integrated into this environment in Jerusalem, with all of these different tribes trying to create one core narrative, right? And you hear this Joseph story, but when you hear Judah, you're like, that's my guy. And when you hear Dan, you're like, that's my guy. And Naphtali, you're like, that's my, right? That's your tribe. And the way that the tribes are always arguing with each other, as well as the brothers are always arguing with each other, right? And Joseph then is two things. First of all, it is the story of how we ended up in Egypt. But it's also the story of how individuals in a family became a people. Because we miss what a transformation it is. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's story, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah, their story ends as a family. Maybe even as a fledgling tribe by that time because of their size, but as a family. We're not a family in Egypt. We're a nation. And so Joseph is the bridge between these two pieces. You're living as a refugee or the child or grandchildren of northern refugees in Jerusalem, unsure of your place. Joseph explains how even though we all come from different places, we're actually cousins. Literally, we're actually families. That all of these disparate political units of these various tribes who, last we heard in the year 1000 were only together because of an evil occupation, that actually we all come from literally the same family. The story of Joseph is the mythology that makes the merging of Exodus and Genesis possible. Which is to say it's the cultural remnant of our people from this moment of integration of northern refugees into the south, right? Germany has taken in a record huge number of Syrian refugees. How is the story that Germany tells itself going to be different in 100 years from now as it integrates the stories of those refugees? Right? How is the American story that we tell ourselves about who we are going to be different as we integrate the enormous number of Latino immigrants who have come in the last generation? Right? Not now. Now is the politics of it all. But 100 years from now, how is the story that those people tell themselves going to be different? How are they going to tell the story of the Alamo differently in 100 years when, 40% of Americans, 50% of Americans have Latino ancestry of some sort or another, right? This is going to change how we articulate our stories, just as we see here. In Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat and his relationship with his brothers and the ways that he brings us from being a family to being a people, and from being a set of disparate nomadic folks in the Levant to being an enslaved enormous people that's so enormous that the Egyptians are worried about us in the land of Egypt. Okay. Thoughts, questions, ideas. That's our big stuff that we are covering for today. That's all our main content for today. So happy to open it up for questions. I don't want to tackle the next chunk of history here. I really want this to sit in because what we're going to deal with, again, not next week because I'll be in Israel, but the week after, is we're going to deal with how it is that, well, the short version is how Babylonian enslavement made the differences between North and South and Abraham and Moses unimportant to us.
Okay, I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
What happens between, so we've gotten David. How does David get to Joseph? Because I get lost because
Yeah. Great question, Sarah.
Like, bleh.
We're going to deal with this also in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on timing next time.
Okay.
But the short version is that there's actually 3 different bodies of mythology in the Hebrew Bible. There's 2 bodies in the Torah. The Torah has the Exodus stories and the Genesis stories, effectively. But the other major body of mythology that exists within the Hebrew Bible is the Davidic mythology, which is to say the Jerusalem mythology. You've got north, you've got south, and you've got Jerusalem. And so we're going to be dealing with that whenever we talk about King Josiah, which will be maybe in 2 weeks, maybe the week after that. We'll see. And how that ends up being integrated. Yes, Susan.
This is a little off point, but it feels related to me. I have always wondered why Joseph is not considered a patriarch. From my perspective, he reflects the best values of all of them. I mean, his forgiveness and his conduct was always admirable, and I've always wondered, and it sounds like it's a function of these historical, like he wasn't part of the South. And is that what you would say? This is fascinating.
Yeah. There's a few different answers there. I think the first is exactly what you're saying, that Joseph fills a different role. Joseph is not a matriarch or a patriarch. He is the bridge between a family and the tribes. But the other thing is that not all Jews descend from Joseph. All Jews descend from Abraham. All Jews descend from Isaac. All Jews descend from Jacob and Rebekah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. But all of their children don't remain in the same tribe. And so, I guess all Jews, at least mythologically, descend from those people too, right? But each of the members of the various tribes would not have identified themselves as coming from all of those collective ancestors. Which is to say that the names of the tribes became the names of Jacob's children, not the other way around. I don't know if that answered the question. Which is to say that tribal identity would have been more important than collective identity, other than trying to create collective identity out of tribal identity. So I think that's probably the origin of that. I'm sure there's a Talmudic answer to this question as well, which is going to be, how did people 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 years after we're talking about right now understand the same idea? Carol.
Hi. My question is totally from a whole different standpoint.
Go for it.
I am a first generation American. I teach a writing workshop and then a lot of journaling classes. And one of my personal goals is to tell my family's story because, as my cousins will laugh, I am now the family matriarch. And just hearing what you're saying, how I've told them it's important to tell me what your memories are. What do you remember? And it's been interesting over the 3 generations, how everyone remembers something different. And some of them are their actual memories, some of them are the stories that their parents told them. So it's kind of like a truly an oy vey experience.
Yes, exactly.
But listening to what you're saying is, and I believe of the importance of these stories, I just don't know how they fit historically with the facts. So I know that they're the stories.
I'd say they fit as historically accurately as the version that 2 generations past are going to tell of the family lore that you told today, which is itself quite different than what actually happened 4 generations or whatever, right? Because every time you're telling that story, what's happening is now that actually the people listening in your family aren't hearing your family stories. They're hearing your version of your family's stories. And then when they tell them on, they're telling their version of your version of, and that's always the nature of story. And, look, I think the other goal that we have in what we are doing in Story of Us is for us to take our ancestors seriously as human beings who had the same level of complexity that we have, which we tend not to do. We wipe that away, right? It's the way we condescendingly speak to old people sometimes, but it's writ large over thousands of years that's happening here. And these people were real people with their own politics, their own petty grievances, and their own mistakes, and their own politics, and their own ways that they interpret and change. And they were full human beings with all the same mythological storytelling impetuses that we have. So I love that you shared that, because I think that's exactly how we should understand these storytellers as well.
And I admire their courage.
Yeah.
They came with very little, like candlesticks hidden in feather beds, and maybe a Star of David necklace, and they came without anything. And 2 generations later, the education level of their kids and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren are absolutely amazing. But to me, it's that courage to do that. And so it's like that's, I guess, the story I want to tell.
No, right? That's again a perfect example, because what you just shared was mythology. Not that it's not true, not that it's not real, not that it's not, but it's mythology, because you were telling that story and it was so clear. Remember our 3-part definition of mythology, that is it tells us who we are, which that's certainly your story just did, where we came from, literally that's what your story was about, and how we're supposed to live in this world with the courage of our ancestors. So there you go. Perfect example. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions?
Okay. I'll shut up now.
Other questions, other thoughts, other anythings? Okay.
Rabbi
Oh yeah,
Daniel,
Jason, please.
Can you just recapitulate those three purposes of mythology? Again,
Yeah. 3 purposes of mythology. It's a story that tells us who we are, where we came from, and how we are supposed to live in this world. Okay. Oh, there's notes in the chat. Let's look here quickly. Jim asks, what does Joseph contribute as the bridge? Not family continuity, but what values, something else? That's an interesting question, Jim. And what I would say is the values are always determined by the people who read it, not by the people who wrote it. That the values of Joseph, I think, to its authors were the oneness of the people of Israel and of Judea. And of the notion that we, being all the descendants of those tribes or those individuals, are part of one people, one collective family, which is to say it is like Carol's story, to tell the story of ourselves and our politics and our past and how we're supposed to live. Okay. See everyone in a couple weeks. Again, no class next week. I'll be back the week after. Oh, but tomorrow, for anyone interested, tomorrow at 5 o'clock on Zoom, we are doing a makeup session for the Israel conversation that did not work on Zoom last week. It's going to cover all the content that we did in person. So if you came in person, don't worry about it. But if you're interested, 5 o'clock tomorrow on Zoom. The link should be in the reminder email that I sent today. So you should all have that as well, or you can find it on CRC's website. Yeah, Rudy.
I'm very thankful for everybody here.
Me too. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip.
Yeah, safe travels.
Yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Sei gesund, and happy happy Thanksgiving, eat well, enjoy, don't fight too much, have a good time.
Amen.